In the heart of Texas, the prison system hides some of the most harrowing secrets that, when exposed, can shake the very foundation of justice. Over 140,000 people are incarcerated in Texas prisons, many of them subjected to harsh, overcrowded conditions. But even worse, corruption runs deep behind the walls. Some prisons, like the infamous San Antonio State Penitentiary, have become breeding grounds for abuse, exploitation, and violence, where the very people who are supposed to uphold the law are often the ones breaking it. But one scandal would rise above all others, a scandal that would expose not only the power dynamics between inmates and correctional officers, but the systemic corruption that allowed it to happen. This is the story of Warden Jessica Carr, a woman who was supposed to protect the law, but instead became entangled in a dangerous and forbidden affair with an inmate named Elias Daniels. This was no ordinary affair. It was the beginning of a network of corruption that would destroy careers, tear lives apart, and shake the Texas prison system to its core. Welcome to Beneath the Surface, where we uncover the stories that were meant to stay hidden. Lies, betrayals, corruption. Because the truth is never what it seems until you dare to look beneath the surface. Are you ready to uncover the untold? Then stay with us, like and subscribe for more exclusive content. Texas has long been a state known for its size, wealth, and booming industries, but its prison system has been infamous for overcrowding, understaffing, and inhumane treatment of inmates. The state incarcerates more people per capita than any other state in the U.S., and with the increasing number of inmates comes an exponential rise in systemic failure. Texas's prisons have long been plagued by issues. Some cells are overcrowded, with 3 inmates sharing a space designed for just one. Violence is commonplace, and medical care is minimal at best. Legal experts, activists, and former inmates have long pointed to these conditions as part of a cycle that leaves people stuck in a broken system, with no hope for reform. But behind the iron gates of these prisons, where every prisoner is seen as a number rather than a person, a darker story was unfolding, one that would reveal just how deep the rot went. Warden Jessica Carr would become a central figure in a scandal that exposed the underbelly of Texas's prison system. Jessica Carr had been with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ, for nearly 2 decades, working her way from a prison guard to one of the most respected and feared wardens in the state. Her climb to power had been marked by a ruthless efficiency that left no room for mistakes. She was known for her tough stance on maintaining order and discipline in the overcrowded facility she ran, San Antonio State Penitentiary. On the surface, Carr was everything a warden should be: disciplined, strategic, and always in control. She had a reputation for being unapproachable, for keeping her personal life out of the equation and running her facility with an iron fist. Her decisions were final. Her word was law. But as Carr walked through the dark halls of San Antonio State Penitentiary each day, there was an underlying truth she had come to realize. Her power was fragile. The prison was overcrowded, understaffed, and on the brink of chaos. Despite her best efforts, it was only a matter of time before her carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. Deep down, Carr was constantly battling the pressure of running a broken system, trying to maintain order in a facility that was practically bursting at the seams. She had done everything by the book, played the game well, but in the end, the pressure of it all was starting to take its toll. Elias Daniels was a man who had seen the worst of life. He was born into poverty, raised in neighborhoods where crime was the only escape from a life of desperation. His criminal record began as a teenager, petty thefts and minor offenses. But as he grew older, so did his crimes, culminating in a violent armed robbery that landed him a 40-year sentence in San Antonio State Penitentiary. On the surface, Daniels was just another inmate in a facility filled with violent criminals. But to underestimate him would be a mistake. Elias wasn't just another prisoner, he was a manipulator, a man who had learned how to navigate the shadows of the prison system with ease. His time behind bars had given him an edge. He understood how to work the system, how to make people believe what he wanted them to believe, and how to extract favors from those in power. He quickly earned a reputation inside the prison, a master of manipulation, someone who could get anything he wanted if he played his cards right. And Daniels was no fool. He understood that the key to survival in prison wasn't brute force, but intelligence, strategy, and timing. He knew the cracks in the system, and he knew how to exploit them. But what Daniels didn't count on was crossing paths with someone as powerful and as vulnerable as Warden Jessica Carr. Their relationship would be one that blurred the lines of right and wrong, ultimately leading them both down a dangerous path. It started innocently enough. Daniels had requested a transfer to a safer block citing harassment from fellow inmates. His request was routine, something that happened every day in prisons across the country. But there was something about Daniels' demeanor that caught Carr's attention. His calm, calculated approach, his ability to present his case with precision, intrigued her. Carr, a seasoned warden, had heard every sob story and complaint imaginable. But Daniels wasn't like the others. He wasn't asking for leniency. He was offering something: insight into the prison's underbelly. Though skeptical at first, Carr agreed to the transfer. She didn't know it then, but that decision would be the first step in a slow descent into a scandal that would change everything. Their first meeting took place in Carr's office, a stark, cold room that felt more like a courtroom than a place of authority. Daniels sat across from her, his eyes steady, unblinking. He spoke in a calm, collected tone, outlining his case for a transfer and offering information about the conditions inside the prison that Carr wasn't aware of. Carr had seen many inmates try to manipulate the system, but Daniels' insight was sharp. He was smart, calculating, and he seemed to know exactly how to speak to her, how to get under her skin. What started as a professional exchange soon turned personal. Daniels quickly realized that Carr had weaknesses, just like anyone else. She wasn't the iron-willed leader she appeared to be on the surface. She was overwhelmed by the prison's conditions, exhausted from managing an overpopulated facility with a minimal budget. It was in these cracks where Daniels saw an opening. As the weeks passed, Daniels' requests grew bolder. He wasn't just asking for better conditions. He was asking for special privileges: a more comfortable cell, better food, access to restricted areas. Carr initially resisted, but Daniels had something she couldn't ignore: valuable information. He knew where contraband was entering the facility, which guards were corrupt, and who was responsible for the violence that ran rampant in the prison. In exchange for Daniels' cooperation, Carr granted him some of the requests he made. But as their meetings grew more frequent, the lines between professional and personal began to blur. Daniels was always polite, always respectful, but there was an underlying tension between them. Carr, despite her best efforts to maintain control, couldn't ignore the attraction she felt. At first, it was just a few casual conversations. Daniels would drop by her office to discuss prison matters. Then, their conversations grew longer, more intimate. The personal details of their lives started to surface. Carr talking about her frustrations as a warden, Daniels opening up about his troubled past. The attraction between them was palpable, but neither of them was willing to admit it. Not yet. As weeks turned into months, the relationship between Carr and Daniels began to shift. What began as a purely transactional exchange of favors, Daniels providing information, Carr granting privileges, evolved into something far more dangerous. The lines between professional duty and personal desire were becoming increasingly blurred, and both Carr and Daniels were aware of the growing tension. One evening, after a long day of managing a particularly difficult situation involving a violent altercation in the yard, Carr retreated to her office to decompress. Daniels, as he had done so often before, found his way to her door. He had information about the fight, but it was clear that there was more to the visit than just business. The conversation started as it always had, But this time, it felt different. Daniels was closer to her than usual, his presence almost magnetic. Carr, trying to maintain her professionalism, focused on the case in front of her. But Daniels' words were more soothing than normal, his tone softer, almost intimate. He asked about her personal life, probing deeper into her frustrations and doubts. Carr, exhausted from the constant stress of her job, found herself talking to him in ways she hadn't expected. She revealed how lonely she had become in her role, how she felt isolated from the rest of the world. And for the first time, Daniel softened his usual sharp edge. He offered words of comfort, not as an inmate seeking leniency, but as someone who seemed to understand her pain. Carr didn't recognize it at the time, but Daniels was slowly wrapping her in a web of emotional manipulation. Later that night, Carr found herself replaying the conversation in her mind. It was the first time she had felt a genuine connection with anyone in years. She tried to brush it off, but the seed had been planted. The next few weeks saw more meetings between the two, and the nature of those meetings began to change. Carr began to confide in Daniels, telling him things she had never shared with anyone else. Her desire for control, her fears about her own career, and her guilt over the state of the prison. Daniels, ever the charmer, listened intently, offering reassurance and understanding. Then, one night, after yet another meeting, Daniels leaned in closer than usual, his eyes locking with hers. "You don't have to be alone in this," he said quietly. Carr's breath caught in her throat. She was aware of how inappropriate the situation was. An inmate, someone she was supposed to be overseeing, crossing a line she had always promised herself would never be crossed. But as his hand brushed hers, she felt something stir within her that she had long buried. In that moment, it felt as though the walls between them had crumbled. The distance, the power imbalance, none of it seemed to matter. She took a slow, shaky breath and found herself drawn to him. Without thinking, she leaned in and kissed him. What had started as a personal relationship quickly became entwined with the darker side of the prison. As the months passed, Daniels continued to leverage his newfound relationship with Carr to gain access to greater privileges, things he had once only dreamed of. With Carr's growing emotional attachment, Daniels knew just how far he could push the boundaries. He had always been aware of the prison's underground operations, the trade in contraband, and the smuggling of illegal goods. But with Carr's involvement, he now had a direct line to the Warden, a line that allowed him to influence the flow of illegal activity within the facility. Carr, blinded by her emotions, failed to recognize the extent to which Daniels was manipulating her. Daniels began to demand more and more, leniency on his behavior reports, special access to restricted areas, and, most disturbingly, influence over which inmates were moved to different cells or blocks. Each time Carr granted him a favor, he made sure to return the gesture, feeding her more information about the inner workings of the prison. But it wasn't just Daniels who benefited from this arrangement. Carr's own position was becoming stronger as well. She had always been skilled at reading people and making calculated decisions, but with Daniels' inside knowledge, she was now able to maintain a tighter grip on the prison. The illicit dealings within the facility were easier to manage, and the other staff, who were already complicit in these activities, began to follow her lead. The prison had become a well-oiled machine of corruption, with Carr and Daniels at its helm. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about power, manipulation, and control. Both of them were getting exactly what they wanted, but at what cost? Daniels' influence within the prison began to extend far beyond Carr's office. He started arranging deals with other inmates, leveraging his access to Carr to smuggle drugs, weapons, and other contraband into the prison. Carr, turning a blind eye, continued to grant him requests, each one more outrageous than the last. But to her, it seemed like nothing more than the natural evolution of their relationship. She never once considered that she was being used. One evening, Daniels came to Carr with an unusual request. There was a group of inmates in solitary confinement who were becoming problematic, he explained. If she could arrange for their transfer to a more manageable block, he would help her root out corruption among the guards. He promised to provide her with a list of corrupt staff members, those who were involved in the illegal activities Daniels had helped facilitate. Carr, eager to maintain control and rid the prison of those who threatened her authority, agreed. She didn't question it. After all, Daniels had always been a source of valuable information, and her bond with him only seemed to grow stronger. But that decision would be the beginning of her unraveling. The inmates who were transferred were soon involved in violent altercations, drugs flooded the new block, and Carr found herself helpless to stop it. What she didn't know was that Daniels had orchestrated the entire situation. He had arranged the transfers not to protect the prison, but to further solidify his own power, manipulating the system for his personal gain. And the corruption didn't stop there. As the months went on, Carr's decisions became more erratic. She was distracted by her emotional attachment to Daniels, and her ability to manage the prison began to deteriorate. Her colleagues began to notice. Guards were taking bribes, inmates were being manipulated, and the system was falling apart from within. Samantha Reed, a guard who had worked at the facility for years, had always been aware of the corruption within the prison. But it wasn't until she started to notice Daniels' growing influence over Carr that she began to question the extent of the issue. Reed had seen how Carr's leadership was slipping. There were whispers in the halls, guards who took bribes, and inmates who received preferential treatment. But the real tipping point came when Reed witnessed one of the more disturbing interactions between Carr and Daniels. She had been patrolling the prison late one evening when she noticed Carr's office lights still on. Curious, Reed approached the door and overheard a heated conversation between the two. Carr was arguing with Daniels, but the conversation soon turned to something far more personal. Reed could hear their voices softening, a level of intimacy that didn't belong in a professional setting. It was at that moment that Reed realized the full extent of the affair. The lines between their professional and personal lives had been completely erased. It was no longer just about the corrupt dealings within the prison. It was about something much more dangerous. Reed knew she had to act. She couldn't sit back and watch this unfold any longer. She began to collect evidence. Footage from surveillance cameras, records of unusual transfers, and testimony from inmates who had been influenced by Daniels' manipulations. It was only a matter of time before Reed's evidence reached the right people. Reed's investigation didn't take long to uncover. She had enough evidence to expose the affair between Carr and Daniels, as well as the full extent of the corruption they had caused. Reed made the difficult decision to take her findings to the media, knowing the consequences it would have for both herself and the warden. When the story broke, it spread like wildfire. Journalists flocked to San Antonio State Penitentiary, eager to report on the scandal. The affair between a powerful warden and a manipulative inmate was the perfect storm for sensational headlines. The public was outraged, and Carr's once sterling reputation was shattered. Authorities immediately launched an investigation. Carr was suspended from her duties, and Daniels was transferred to a maximum security facility. But the scandal was far from over. As the investigation continued, more details of the prison's corruption came to light. Guards were implicated, and several inmates testified about the illegal activities they had witnessed. For Carr, it was the end of her career. Her actions, fueled by emotional manipulation and a desire for control, had led to her downfall. Daniels, though behind bars, had orchestrated the entire scandal from the shadows, his influence reaching far beyond the walls of the prison. The scandal that rocked the Texas prison system had far-reaching consequences. Warden Jessica Carr was arrested and charged with bribery, corruption, and abuse of power. Elias Daniels' manipulation had torn apart the very system that was supposed to contain him, and the fallout from the investigation would shake the foundations of the Texas prison system forever. As for Reed, she continued to work in the prison system, but the experience left her with deep scars. She had seen the worst of human nature, and though the scandal had been exposed, she knew the fight for justice was far from over. The question remains, how many other systems, like the one in Texas, remain hidden behind closed doors, corrupt from the inside out. As the news of the affair between Warden Jessica Carr and Elias Daniels broke, the public response was swift and unforgiving. Media outlets pounced on the story, eager to cover the salacious details. Headlines screamed about the corrupt warden and the inmate who had manipulated her for years. The prison system, which was already in disarray, was now under the harsh spotlight of national scrutiny. The investigation into the scandal grew exponentially. Local authorities raided Carr's office, finding damning evidence that confirmed Reed's claims. Documents detailing preferential treatment for Daniels, recordings of their personal meetings, and records of illegal transactions. The once pristine reputation of San Antonio State Penitentiary, one of the largest and most notorious prisons in Texas, had been permanently tarnished. Former inmates, emboldened by the exposure, began to speak out. Some revealed how Daniels had used his connection with Carr to control the prison's internal economy, arranging for contraband to be smuggled in, orchestrating violent confrontations, and even manipulating transfers to increase his power over other inmates. Others came forward with stories of how Carr had turned a blind eye to the corruption that ran through the entire facility. In the midst of the media frenzy, Carr remained silent. She was not granted the opportunity to defend herself publicly. Her once strong facade was crumbling, and for the first time in years, she realized just how isolated she had become. The affair, which had once seemed like an escape from her own troubled emotions, had destroyed everything she had worked for. Daniel's charm, his ability to manipulate the situation to his advantage, had brought her to the lowest point of her career. The emotional toll on Carr was staggering. As the days passed, she faced mounting pressure from the state and the media. Her colleagues, those who once respected her, now distanced themselves from her. The prison system she had so carefully crafted had been exposed for its deep flaws. She was left to confront the truth, her own moral failings, her failure to maintain control, and the dangerous consequences of a relationship she had allowed to fester. Within weeks of the media revelations, the fallout was impossible to ignore. Carr was officially arrested and charged with multiple counts of corruption, bribery, and abuse of power. The charges were devastating, not just for her but for the entire Texas correctional system. Her arrest was covered in real time with news crews waiting outside the prison, cameras flashing as she was escorted out in handcuffs. For Daniels, the consequences were equally severe. Although he was already serving a lengthy sentence, his involvement in the affair and his role in orchestrating the corruption within the prison led to an extended sentence. Daniels was transferred to a maximum security facility in a different part of Texas, where his influence no longer reached the prison system. But the damage caused by their illicit relationship wasn't confined to just Carr and Daniels. The scandal exposed the depths of corruption within the prison system. Several guards and correctional officers were arrested, implicated in the illegal operations that had flourished under Carr's watch. Investigators uncovered evidence of smuggling rings, bribery, and violent assaults against inmates that had been overlooked for years. Despite the arrests, many questions remained unanswered. How many more warden-inmate relationships had gone unnoticed? How deep did the corruption run within the Texas prison system? Could this scandal be the wake-up call needed to prompt real reform? Or would it be just another chapter in a system that had failed to change for decades? As investigators dug deeper into the scandal, they realized that the affair between Carr and Daniels was just the tip of the iceberg. The corrupt activities they had been involved in had only scratched the surface of what had been happening inside Texas prisons for years. The media attention forced the state government to address the growing concern about systemic abuse within the correctional facilities. Reports began to emerge about the widespread abuse of power that affected not just inmates, but also staff members. Guards had been taking bribes to smuggle contraband, and some had been involved in violent assaults against prisoners. Prisoners in solitary confinement reported being left without food or medical care for extended periods of time. Whistleblowers came forward, describing a prison system that had become so broken that the authorities who were supposed to enforce the law had become the very perpetrators of the corruption. The findings of the investigation were staggering. Thousands of inmates had suffered at the hands of guards who were supposed to protect them. Families of inmates who had been wronged began to rally for justice, demanding that those responsible be held accountable. The public was outraged. The truth about the Texas prison system, hidden for so long behind walls of secrecy and power, was now in the open. A call for prison reform grew louder, with politicians and activists pushing for changes in the system. But many questioned whether the reforms would be enough to prevent future scandals. Could the state truly address the deep-rooted problems within the system? Or would this scandal be buried like so many others? As the investigation unfolded, Carr was forced to confront the full extent of her actions. She had allowed herself to be manipulated by Daniels, someone who had used her vulnerability against her. The affair, which had started as an escape from her loneliness and frustration, had spiraled out of control, leading to the collapse of everything she had worked so hard to build. For Carr, the emotional toll was unbearable. She had lost her career, her reputation, and her sense of self. The shame she felt was overwhelming. She had failed not just herself, but the thousands of inmates who had placed their trust in the prison system. She had allowed her emotions to cloud her judgment, to the point where she had compromised the very values she was supposed to uphold. In the courtroom, Carr sat in silence as the charges were read against her. The weight of her actions hung over her like a dark cloud. She couldn't escape the truth. She had been a part of a system that had exploited and abused people for years. She had become the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the prison system. Daniels, on the other hand, remained unrepentant. He continued to play the game, manipulating the situation to his advantage, even from behind bars. But while Daniels' fate seemed sealed, Carr's was still uncertain. She was a woman who had once held the power to control lives, and now she was at the mercy of a system she had once commanded. The scandal had left a deep scar on the Texas prison system. The investigation revealed just how deeply corruption had taken root, with dozens of guards and prison officials arrested. But the impact went beyond the arrests and the media coverage. The scandal forced the state to reckon with a broken system that had allowed such abuse to go on unchecked for years. Prison reform activists seized the moment, pushing for a complete overhaul of the Texas correctional system. Calls for better oversight, increased accountability, and a reduction in the prison population echoed across the state. But while the scandal had sparked a national conversation about prison reform, the real question remained: could anything truly change? Or would the system continue to perpetuate the same cycle of abuse, corruption, and neglect? As the dust settled, Carr was left to reflect on the choices she had made. Her career was over, and the relationships she had relied on, those with Daniels, her colleagues, and even herself, had all been shattered. She could no longer ignore the moral failings that had led her down this path. The affair, the manipulation, the corruption, it had all culminated in a catastrophic failure. For Daniels, the scandal had only extended his sentence, but his manipulation had left a lasting mark on the prison system. He had exposed the weaknesses of a system that allowed people like him to rise to power, and in the end, he had left a trail of destruction in his wake. Carr's downfall served as a cautionary tale, one that highlighted the dangers of unchecked power, the consequences of emotional vulnerability in positions of authority, and the corrupting influence of the prison system itself. But as the scandal faded from the headlines, one thing remained clear: the fight for reform was far from over. The Texas prison system still had a long way to go before it could be rebuilt, and Carr's story was just one of many that showed how deep the cracks ran. The scandal that rocked the Texas prison system exposed more than just a forbidden affair. It revealed the systemic corruption that had festered within the walls of the state's largest correctional facilities. Warden Jessica Carr and inmate Elias Daniels became symbols of everything that was wrong with the prison system. Two people who had allowed their personal and professional lives to become irreversibly intertwined in the worst possible way. While Carr's fall from grace was swift and public, Daniels remained a figure of intrigue, a man who had manipulated the system for his own gain. And as the investigation continued, more questions were raised about the true extent of corruption within Texas prisons. Would this scandal finally lead to meaningful reform? Or would it be buried under the weight of bureaucracy and politics? Only time would tell. As we uncover the shadows where crime lurks, we're reminded that the truth is often far darker than it appears. What starts as a whisper behind closed doors can ripple through a system, shaking everything it touches. But with each story revealed, we gain the clarity to confront the darkness head-on, demanding justice where it has long been denied. This has been Beneath the Surface, the dark side of crime. Stay tuned for more shocking truths and untold stories as we continue to peel back the layers of the criminal world and expose the corruption, betrayal, and hidden realities that shape our society. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is crucial in the fight for truth. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and keep searching for the truth, no matter where it hides.